Part 2, continuation. Okay, double taxation. In strict sense, okay, the direct duplicate taxation. Ano to? Under the direct duplicate taxation or the DDT, okay, the same property must be taxed twice when it should have been taxed once. Okay, so there are requisites. There are 5. 1. Both taxes must be imposed on the same property of subject or subject matter. So, dalawang taxes ang na-impose. Number 2, the taxes imposed are for the same purpose. It is also for same state or government or taxing authority within the same territory, jurisdiction, or taxing district during the same taxing period and of the same kind or character. Doon naman sa broad sense, ano yung broad sense? Yung IDT. Indirect, di ba? Kanina, direct. Ngayon naman, indirect duplicate taxation. There is double taxation in the broad sense or indirect duplicate taxation if any of the elements for direct duplicate taxation is absent. So, there is no constitutional prohibition against double taxation in the Philippines. So, ang sabi dito, okay, wala daw pong nagbabawal na walang nakalagay sa konstitusyon na nagpapabawal against double taxation in the Philippines. Although it is something not favored, okay, it is still permissible provided na yung mga requirements under the law are not violated. As long as the tax law follows all the constitutional rule and the limitation and the uniformity rule, there can be no valid objection to the taxing the same income, business, or property. Can you shift or can you escape from taxation? The question is, the answer is, there are many ways of shifting the tax burden. Okay? Pero you cannot escape taxation talaga. Except if you're already, di ka talaga nagbabayad intentionally. Mas mali yung kung magbayad ka man. Mas mali nga sa return mo. Okay? We have the forward shifting, the backward shifting. In the forward shifting, here, when the burden of the tax is transferred from a factor of production through the factors of distribution until it finally settles on the ultimate purchaser or consumer. An example is the VAT or the value added tax and the percentage tax. How about yung backward shifting? Here, when the burden of the tax is transferred from the consumer or purchaser through the factors of distribution to the factor of production. Example, the consumer or purchaser may shift tax imposed on him to the retailer by purchasing only after the price is reduced, and from the latter to the wholesaler and finally to the manufacturer. We also have the onward shifting, which is when the tax is shifted 2 or more times, either backward or forward. Another way to escape taxation is the so-called tax avoidance or tax minimization. Okay, is this illegal? Okay. Here, the exploitation by the taxpayer of legally permissible alternative tax rates or methods of accessing taxable property or income in order to avoid or reduce tax liability. It is politely called tax minimization. Is this punishable by law? Hindi po. Okay? Example, Pedro refrains from engaging in some activity or enjoying some privileges in order to avoid incidental taxation or to lower his tax bracket for a taxable year. Ito ang illegal, yung tax evasion or yung tax dodging. Okay? Tax evasion is the use by the taxpayer of illegal or fraudulent means to defeat or lessen the payment of tax. It is also known as tax dodging. Okay? It is punishable by law. Example, okay? It is deliberately, there is a example, si Pedro, he deliberately failed to report a taxable income or property. Okay? When also when there is an overstatement on the expenses. Ayan. There are the so-called elements of tax evasion. There are three. There is the end to be achieved. Example, the payment of less than that known by the taxpayer to be legally due or in paying no tax when is due. And such is due pala. And another one is the accompanying state of mind, which is evil in nature. And lastly, the course of action is unlawful. There is the called willful blindness doctrine. Okay, the willful blindness doctrine states that a taxpayer can no longer raise the defense that the errors on their tax returns are not their responsibility, or that it is the fault of their accountants they hired. Okay? Intent to defraud need not be shown for a conviction of tax evasion. The only thing that needs to be proven is that the taxpayer was aware of his obligation to file the tax return, but he nevertheless voluntarily, knowingly, and intentionally failed to file his return. So, remember that tax avoidance is also called as tax minimization, while tax evasion is also called as tax dodging. The means in tax avoidance is legal, while in tax evasion is illegal. Okay? Is tax avoidance punishable under the law? No. Pero ang tax evasion, it is. So, yes. So, the purpose of tax avoidance is only to minimize the payment or para tax saving device kasi to. Pero ang tax evasion is to entirely escape from payment of taxation. So, we also have the so-called exemption from taxation. Okay? Meaning of exemption from taxation. The grant of immunity to particular persons or corporation or to persons or corporation of a particular class from a tax which person and corporation generally within the same state or taxing district are obliged to pay. It is an immunity or privilege. It is free from a financial charge or burden to which they are subjected. It is strictly construed against the taxpayer. Always remember po that taxation is the rule and exemption is the exception. So, if Pedro claims exemption, he must be able to justify his claims or rights by a grant expressed in terms too plain to be mistaken and too categorical to be misinterpreted. If not expressly mentioned in the law, it must at least be within the purview by clear legislative intent. So, what are the grounds for tax exemption? Paano pa ma-exempt si Pedro sa taxation? First, it may be based on contract. Second, it may be based on some ground of public policy. It can also be created in treaty on grounds of reciprocity or to lessen the rigors of international or multiple taxation. The tax exemption can be expressed can be implied, or it can be contractual. When we say express or affirmative, it is already provided under the Constitution. It is nakalagay sa Constitution, nakasulat, nakalagay, okay, nakaprint sa Constitution, sa statutes, sa treaties, ordinances, okay, contracts, ganyan. Pag implied, okay, when a tax law is levied on certain classes without mentioning the other classes, okay, always remember that exemptions are not presumed, it must be proven. But when the public is involved, exemption is the rule and taxation is the exception. Bakit? Kasi nga po, the general rule when the subject of the taxation is the national government agencies and instrumentalities, the rule is different. Okay? Diba? Ang rule is, in that case, is exemption is the rule and taxation is the exception. Lastly is the contractual. The legislative of a state may, in the absence of special restriction in its constitution, make a valid contract with a corporation in respect to taxation, and that such contract can be enforced against the state at the instance of the corporation. Remember, in a contractual exemption, the essential elements of contract must be present. There must be consent between the parties. Okay? What is the rationale of tax exemption? Bakit ba may tinatawag na tax exemption? Anong importansya nito dito? Okay? Such exemption will benefit the body of the people and not particular individuals or private interests. And here, the public benefit is sufficient to offset the monetary loss entailed in the grant of the exemption. Is the tax exemption revocable? The general rule is it is revocable. Who? By the government. As an exemption, if there is a contractual tax exemption, okay, it cannot be unilaterally revoked by the taxing authority without thereby violating the non-impairment clause under the Constitution. So, generally, pwedeng bawiin ang mga tax exemption. Pero kung there's a contract entered between parties, between the taxpayer and the government, it cannot unilaterally revoke it because it will be a violation of the non-impairment clause under the Constitution. What is the so-called doctrine of equitable recoupment? Ano to? Okay? The doctrine of equitable recoupment, okay? It allows a taxpayer whose claim for refund has been barred by prescription to offset such claim against current assessment. This doctrine finds no application in our jurisdiction. Pero just to give you a knowledge about the doctrine of equitable recoupment, okay? In here, the doctrine allows the government to offset taxes that have not been collected from the taxpayer against a current claim for refund, although the government is time-barred from collecting the previous tax. In here kasi, okay, meron ng yung gobyerno po is inaalaw niyang i-offset yung tax mo kahit na time barred or siguro nag-expire na yung time for the government to collect. Okay? Hindi pwede yon. So, the doctrine finds no application in our jurisdiction. The prohibition on compensation and set-off. The general rule po kasi is that taxes cannot be subject to compensation. Bakit? Okay? Because ang government and the taxpayers are not creditor and debtor of each other. Okay? Hindi to utang. Hindi siya pwede i-set off kasi hindi po siya utang. Okay? It's not a debt. Okay? As an exemption, of course, when it is due, there's demandable and fully liquidated. Yan. Compromise naman, okay? A contract whereby the parties, by making reciprocal concessions to avoid litigation or put an end to one already commenced. This is provided under your civil code, okay? So there are instances where tax can be compromised, which are the following requisites. Okay, number 1, the taxpayer must have a tax liability. Number 2, there must be an offer, the offer can be from the taxpayer or the government or through the commissioner. Number 3, there must be an acceptance by the commissioner or the taxpayer, as the case may be. Always remember that the tax liability, yung offer, and yung acceptance must concur. Otherwise, tax cannot be compromised. Kasi nga po, again, compromise is reduction of the taxpayer's liability. Remember, when itong mga tax exemption na to, it should be proven by the taxpayer that he is entitled to such exemption, because taxation is the rule and exemption is the exception. Tax amnesty. Next, tax amnesty. Tax amnesty is different from tax exemption. Bakit po? In tax amnesty kasi, the benefit is the immunity from civil, criminal, administrative liability arising from non-payment of taxes. From the word amnesty, amnesia. So, kakalimutan na lahat yung mga utang mo sa gobyerno. Okay? Kahit na tax evasion, nag-tax evade ka pa. Okay, so you will be immune from civil, criminal, and administrative liability. Pero ang tax exemption po, immune ka lang sa civil liability mo. Ano yun? That is relief from payment of taxes. Who is covered by tax amnesty? Okay, those that are past tax liability. Pero ang tax exemption, yung future. Okay? Is there an actual revenue loss in tax amnesty? Obviously, there is po. Kasi nga, papatawarin ka for non-payment of tax. Pero in tax evasion, there is none. Always remember po na ang tax laws are generally construed strictly against the government and liberally in favor of the taxpayer. And no person or property is subject to taxation unless within the terms or plain imports of taxing statute. Okay? So, a tax payable by individuals does not apply to corporation kasi an individual is a human being or human being or individuals, and corporations are juridical persons to mga to. So, that ends our discussion on the general principles of taxation. The next topic will be income taxation. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.